Welcome to the Daily Globe. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. As autumn settles over Washington, the Supreme Court faces a term of historic consequence. The justices are set to decide whether President Trump's sweeping tariffs, imposed during his second term, overstep constitutional limits on presidential power. This case isn't just about trade, it's a test of the balance between executive authority and congressional control, a tension as old as the Republic. For Trump, the tariffs are a bold assertion of national sovereignty. For critics, they're an unconstitutional tax enacted without Congress. The ruling will shape the future of executive power, impact the economy, and test the court's independence in a deeply polarized nation. The world is watching as the court prepares to define the limits of American presidential authority. President Trump's tariffs began as a core part of his economic philosophy, reflecting his long-held belief that America had been taken advantage of by its trading partners for decades. From the campaign trail to the Oval Office, Trump argued that previous administrations had allowed foreign countries to flood the U.S. market with cheap goods, undermining American workers and industries. He promised to reverse this trend and restore what he called fairness to international trade. The tariffs were aimed at countering what he described as decades of unfair trade practices, particularly from countries like China, which he accused of manipulating currency and stealing intellectual property. Supporters saw the tariffs as a bold move to protect American jobs and revive struggling industries, while critics warned of economic fallout and rising prices for consumers. Unlike the more targeted tariffs of the past, which focused on specific products or countries, Trump's approach was sweeping and global. He imposed reciprocal duties on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, affecting everything from steel and aluminum to electronics and agricultural products. These actions were justified under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, a law originally intended to address national security threats. Critics, including many legal scholars and economists, argued that IEPA was never meant to be used for broad economic policy or trade disputes. They contended it was designed for true national emergencies, such as war or terrorism, not for reshaping the global trading system. This sparked heated debates in Congress and the courts about the limits of presidential power. The Trump administration, however, insisted that the long-term decline of American manufacturing was itself an extraordinary threat to the nation's security and prosperity. They pointed to shuttered factories, lost jobs, and shrinking communities as evidence that urgent action was needed. The tariffs quickly became Trump's main tool for negotiating new trade deals. They were used as leverage in high-stakes talks with the European Union, Japan, Canada, and Mexico, resulting in a series of new or revised agreements. The administration touted these deals as proof that tough tactics could force trading partners to the table and secure better terms for American workers. Yet, while the White House celebrated these diplomatic victories, the reality on the ground was more complicated. Many American businesses, especially small manufacturers and farmers, faced higher costs for imported materials and equipment. Some struggled to pass those costs on to customers, while others lost access to key export markets as countries like China retaliated with their own tariffs. The result was a deeply divided economic landscape. Some industries and regions benefited from new protections and investment, while others suffered from lost sales and uncertainty. Across the country, the tariffs left a legacy of winners and losers, fueling an ongoing debate about the true costs and benefits of America's new approach to trade. Legal challenges erupted as soon as the tariffs were announced, sparking a nationwide debate that quickly escalated into a series of high-stakes court battles. Businesses, large and small, argued vehemently that the president had overstepped his authority, infringing upon Congress's exclusive power over trade and taxation. The stakes were high, with many fearing the economic repercussions of such unilateral decisions. Federal courts across the country repeatedly ruled against the administration, stating that the tariffs exceeded the authority granted by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. These rulings were seen as a significant check on executive power. Judges meticulously examined the legal text of the IEPA, concluding that the tariffs were not justified under the Act's provisions. Legal scholars and analysts pored over these decisions, debating their implications for future executive actions. The Court of International Trade and the Federal Circuit both declared the tariffs unconstitutional, asserting that they undermined Congress's core powers. These decisions sent shockwaves through the political and business communities. Legal experts argued that allowing the tariffs to stand would set a dangerous precedent, effectively eroding the checks and balances that are fundamental to the U.S. Constitution. The debate became a focal point for discussions on the separation of powers. However, a strong dissenting opinion emerged, advocating for more deference to the president's judgment in matters of national security and economic policy. This dissent provided a glimmer of hope for the administration, suggesting that the legal battle was far from over. The Trump administration, buoyed by the dissent, prepared for a final showdown in the highest court of the land. Officials expressed optimism that the Supreme Court might reverse the lower court's decisions. The Federal Circuit stayed its ruling, providing the administration with a crucial window to appeal. This stay also served as a stark warning of the potential economic chaos that could ensue if the tariffs were abruptly struck down. As the appeal process unfolded, the nation watched closely. Economic indicators fluctuated, and businesses braced for the impact of the final decision. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the markets, reflecting the high stakes of the case. Now the Supreme Court stands as the final arbiter in a case that has become a defining constitutional showdown. The justices' decision will not only determine the fate of the tariffs, but also set a precedent for the balance of power between the branches of government. The legal journey has reached its climax, with the entire nation awaiting the Supreme Court's ruling. The outcome will shape the future of executive authority and congressional power for years to come. As the Supreme Court's new term begins, the fate of the Trump tariffs hangs in the balance. If the court doesn't intervene, the lower court's decision will take effect, forcing the government to halt collections and refund billions. Experts give the administration slim odds, citing strong constitutional arguments against the tariffs and a string of lower court defeats. Still, Trump remains defiant, urging the court to uphold his authority and quietly shifting to more targeted tariffs under different laws. The court itself faces intense scrutiny, with public trust split along partisan lines. Even Trump's appointees are seen as unpredictable, making the outcome uncertain. The stakes, legal, economic, and political, could not be higher. The economic stakes are enormous. The tariffs have generated up to $165 billion a year, plugging holes in the federal budget. If struck down, the government could owe up to $150 billion in refunds to businesses, creating a fiscal crisis. The loss of tariff leverage could unravel major trade deals with the EU and Japan, forcing renegotiations. For consumers, ending the tariffs could mean lower prices and relief from inflation. But domestic industries protected by the tariffs, like steel and aluminum, would face renewed foreign competition. The decision will ripple through every sector, creating new winners and losers. The economic fallout will be swift and far-reaching. The court's ruling is a referendum on Trump's brand of executive action. Striking down the tariffs would be a major blow, fueling claims of presidential overreach and energizing opposition ahead of the midterms. Upholding them would embolden the executive branch, setting a precedent for broader use of emergency powers. The outcome will shape not just Trump's legacy, but the future balance of power between the president and Congress. A ruling against the tariffs could prompt Congress to reassert its authority over trade. Either way, the decision will deepen partisan divides and test public trust in the court. The stakes are personal, political, and institutional. At the heart of the case is the separation of powers, the Constitution's safeguard against concentrated authority. The court must decide if Congress gave away too much power when it passed IEEPA, letting the president impose sweeping tariffs. Striking down the tariffs would reaffirm Congress's control over trade and taxation, setting a clear limit on emergency powers. Upholding them would expand presidential authority, allowing future presidents to bypass Congress on major economic policy. The justices must walk a fine line between interpreting statutes and protecting constitutional boundaries. The decision will set a precedent for how far emergency powers can reach in the modern era. The outcome will echo through future battles over the separation of powers. Experts across the legal and policy spectrum are deeply divided, but a growing number see the Supreme Court as increasingly skeptical of the administration's broad use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This skepticism is rooted in concerns about executive overreach and the potential for unchecked presidential authority in matters of trade and national security. Many legal scholars argue that the court's recent questions and comments during oral arguments suggest a willingness to rein in the administration's expansive interpretation of its powers, especially when those powers have far-reaching economic consequences. The strong lower court rulings against the tariffs, combined with recent expert surveys, point to a high probability that the Supreme Court will ultimately strike down the administration's actions. These lower courts have consistently emphasized the importance of clear statutory limits and the dangers of allowing the executive branch to act without meaningful oversight. The expert consensus, while not unanimous, leans toward the view that the justices will prioritize the rule of law and the separation of powers over deference to the executive. Still, the dissenting opinion in the Federal Circuit offers a compelling alternative for justices who are inclined to favor strong executive power. This dissent argues that, in times of national security or economic uncertainty, the president should be granted broad discretion to act swiftly and decisively. It frames the issue as one of national interest, suggesting that judicial intervention could undermine the government's ability to respond to global threats and economic instability. The Supreme Court's decision may not fall along predictable ideological lines. While some justices are known for their conservative or liberal leanings, the complexities of trade and economic policy often blur these boundaries. Pro-business justices, for example, might oppose the tariffs not out of opposition to executive power, but out of concern for economic stability and the potential harm to American companies and markets. The stakes are high, and the justices' reasoning may surprise observers on both sides. Justice Brett Kavanaugh is widely seen as a pivotal swing vote in this case. His past opinions show a nuanced approach to executive authority, and court watchers are closely analyzing his questions and comments for clues. Even the justices appointed by President Trump are not guaranteed to support the administration's position, as their judicial philosophies sometimes diverge from political expectations. The outcome may hinge on how these justices interpret the balance between presidential power and congressional oversight. Regardless of the final outcome, the Supreme Court's ruling will have far-reaching implications for how future presidents pursue protectionist policies. It will set a precedent that could either limit or expand the executive's ability to impose tariffs and other trade restrictions, shaping the strategies of future administrations. Legal experts agree that this decision will force a fundamental shift in the way the White House approaches economic emergencies and international trade disputes. Ultimately, the court's decision will reshape the landscape of both trade policy and executive power in the United States, sending ripples through global markets and setting the tone for the relationship between the branches of government for years to come. The Supreme Court's decision on the Trump tariffs will define the boundaries of presidential power for years to come. It will clarify how far a president can go in using emergency powers for economic policy without Congress. The economic impact will be immediate, affecting budgets, trade deals, and prices for consumers and businesses. Politically, the ruling will influence the midterms and shape future presidential strategies. The case is a stress test for the American constitutional system, forcing a reckoning with the limits of executive authority. The legacy will be measured by its impact on the balance of power at the heart of American democracy. The world is watching as the court prepares to render its verdict.